Welcome to episode 18 of the show. Taking advantage of the summer weather, just sitting outside here at my house. Gonna answer some questions here about solving harshness in your mix, vocal compressors during tracking, and also vocal delays in the mix. Some stuff about interfaces and whether you really need a vocal compressor to track vocals at home.
3, 2, 1. This is the ASKJV Show.
Our first question comes from Erdink. My problem is my mixes are sounding too harsh. When I cut the harsh frequencies, then the whole energy goes away. Well, in both scenarios, it's just not fun to listen to those songs. How do you keep the energy and not sounding too harsh?
I've got a couple ideas for you. The first thing would be maybe you're just cutting too much. So usually if I'm dipping out some high end or some high mid frequencies to get rid of harshness, it's really only like a very narrow dip, 1 to 2 dB max usually. So that's one thing. Maybe you're just taking it too much and losing that energy. Another thing is you could try doing more low pass filtering on your instruments in your mixes. A lot of people, always talk about doing a lot of high pass filtering, to cut off everything below 100 on all your tracks that aren't supposed to be contributing to the bass. And that's true, but you could also do that the other way around. So I will very frequently have low pass filters, 10, 12K, 14K, even way lower for some instruments. If I don't need anything in that high range from that track, I'll filter it out. So maybe practice doing a little more of that, and that goes from everything from certain drum tracks to definitely bass. You can use a filter at 4K even on a bass track. For guitars, anywhere from like 8 to 12K, you can put the low pass filter on there. So try doing a little bit more of that throughout the tracks in your mix. And the last thing I'd say is that one thing with in the box mixing and recording is you kind of don't have that softness that you kind of get from some analog gear, and especially from tape in the old days. So maybe try using some more saturation plugins in your mix if you're mixing in the box. Maybe some tape emulation plugins. A lot of times if I get a really harsh guitar or a harsh track, I'll throw on the Massey tape head or some other tape simulator plugin, and it just kind of soaks up some of that harsh high end and just makes it a little smoother. And that's kind of an automatic thing I think in my head is if something is really harsh and abrasive in the top end and the high mids, I usually try to reach for some sort of subtle saturation or tape emulation plugin to kind of soak that up and just smooth it over. So there's some tips. Hopefully that helps.
How does the Duet compare to the 192 in terms of sound?
Hey man, glad you're paying attention and following along and seeing the evolution of my setup and everything. The Duet sounds good so far, but I'm only mixing on it, so I'm pretty much just using the 2 stereo outputs to monitor from. So I can't really give a super in-depth review of that. I think when it comes to converters, especially these days, since they're so good, even starting at the low end, you really don't start to hear the difference until tracks are stacking on top of each other. So, maybe if I was recording a whole album with a Duet, with dozens of tracks, and start to maybe hear a difference. But since I'm just mixing out of the main outputs, there's no audible difference for sure. But yeah, I definitely have noticed, from going from more budget converters up to like the 192, I did hear a difference for sure, especially again, like I said, stacking tracks. So maybe this is a long answer to a really simple question, but that just gives you kind of a little bit behind the scenes of it's not that important, especially an Apogee Duet converter is going to be more than clean and clear enough for just mixing on.
Our next question comes from Sean. I'm currently reading your book, Mixing Heavy Music. I had a few questions about some of your vocal mixing section. Do you have a go-to comp for a vocal tracking compressor? I would imagine you use a fast attack and release with a lower ratio on the way in, is that correct? In the book, you speak about using delays instead of reverb. Do you ever use delay values in the Haas range, or do you adjust the delays based on the tempo?
All right, this is a meaty question. So first part, vocal compressor while tracking. I use the distressor, and I have it at 6-to-1, attack 4, and release run 3. I don't know what that is in milliseconds, but I've just kind of experimented with some settings, and that's what I've landed on. I think it sounds pretty good for aggressive vocals. And even though it's 6-1, it's pretty transparent. Like I'll go up to 10, 12 dB gain reduction easy, and it's very smooth and transparent. So that's what I'm using on the way in. Tracking. What was the second part of your question? Oh yeah, delays. So vocal delays. The 180 and 220 thing was a stereo delay setup that I have. So you send a mono vocal to this stereo delay return, and it delays the left side by 180 and the right side by 220, and that gives you the stereo widening effect. And it's just kind of a very quick, almost slap style, and I just mix that in just enough to make the vocal sound a little more energized and a little bit wider. And that's always at those numbers. It's not changing based on tempo, but I do use a lot of delays that are based on tempo aside from that. So that's just one kind of my kind of go-to vocal delay that I use instead of reverb is the 180 220 thing that you're talking about in the book. And the last part of your question was about the Haas delays, which is, if I remember correctly, that is the idea that delays under 40 milliseconds, our ear perceives them as just part of the source and not an actual delayed sound. The only time that I use those tends to be when I am setting up pre-delays for reverbs. So sometimes for like a snare plate or some type of drum reverb, I'll play with the pre-delay sound maybe between 10 and 30 milliseconds. Try to find something that kind of leaves the delay, leaves it clear, leaves the sound clear of reverb during that initial drum attack, and then is out of the way by the time the reverb kicks in. And obviously that's happening extremely fast at numbers like below 30 milliseconds, but it does help for clarity and doesn't cloud over the initial hit. So yeah, that's kind of the only scenario where I use that. I think maybe in some unique situations where I'm trying to make a mono track sound stereo, I might do a similar thing like I just talked about with the 180 220, but doing that very, very, very short, even within that 40 millisecond range, delaying a left and right side and kind of therefore making it sound stereo while it still was a mono source track. A little bit hard to explain in this podcast, just talking it out, but hopefully that you understand what I mean there and can play around and experiment and kind of discover it on your own.
Our last question comes from Raymer. Just wondering, do I really need a compressor like a distressor to record vocals at home with good results?
No, you definitely don't need it, especially these days with digital and headroom. It's you don't have to worry about having a compressor to keep from peaking. You can just leave a lot of headroom on the preamp when you're recording. And so yeah, you definitely don't need to have a compressor to record vocals at home. I just personally, ever since I started using it, I fell in love with it because it just gives you that much closer to a finished record sound right off the bat, right when you're tracking, which I always love. Like whenever I'm tracking projects, I have plugins everywhere and stuff, and not super in-depth, but just quick and dirty EQ and compression just to get it sounding like a record in the room, so it's exciting, it keeps the band motivated, keeps me interested and all that. So if you can afford it, absolutely get a good vocal compressor, but if you can't, don't worry. I certainly get sent plenty of records to mix that were not recorded with compression on the vocal on the way in, and you just do it after the fact. So no worries on that. You definitely don't need it. All right, thanks for tuning in again for this episode. Of course, it's kind of funny. As soon as I start recording this, there's an airplane flying and someone cutting their grass over there. Hopefully the audio is all right for you guys. I believe when this comes out, my editing course is going to be 1 or 2 weeks away from launching. So if you're not on my email list, make sure you jump on it, get your free mixing cheat sheet at the link below here, or if you're listening to the podcast, go to hardcoremusicstudio.com. Get on my mailing list there. Not only will you get a bunch of free stuff, but you'll be on the list to make sure you see when the editing course is launched. And that's a really in-depth course that shows you how I edit drums, use Beat Detective for drums, and how to edit bass and guitars, vocals, auto-tune, vocal line, all that stuff. Very in-depth. I think it's going to be really good for a lot of you guys. So make sure you're on the list. Check that out. If you are on the list, keep an eye out for my emails coming up in the next week or two. Other than that, hit like, subscribe to the podcast. It really helped me out a lot. Tell your friends about it, and submit your questions to AskJVPod.com if you want to get your question on the show. I'm trying to answer as many as I can here, so keep it coming. It's a lot of fun. All right, until next time. Talk to you later.